Welcome to the Joy of the Truth, the broadcast where we uncover the hidden treasures of Catholic teaching. I'm Jeff Arrowwood, your host, and this is episode 2, Born That Way. Today's topic starts with the question, is there a genetic or a biological cause for some sin? Now, most often we hear this regarding homosexuality. Father James Martin, for example, and there are other homosexual advocates out there, assume that homosexuals are born that way. And for the record, there really is no scientific evidence for the genetic cause or a biological cause of homosexuality. It's something I've been following since college with quite a bit of interest. One of my degrees is in psychology, so this was something that really interested me. And there really has never been evidence of any genetic or biological cause. There is some weak evidence of some biological factors, but nothing very strong. But for the sake of argument for today, let's assume that there is a genetic component to homosexuality. And after all, there are many other sins and weaknesses that do have a strong genetic component. Some of the most powerful genetic components would be violent tendencies, lust, and then there are other things like coping disorders and depression that are genetic or biological that can lead us into sin or make us more susceptible to sin as well. So let's just take that question and say, yes, there is a biological or genetic component to many of the weaknesses and to some sins. The real question is, what does a biological component of sin really mean? Here's the main question we're discussing today. Does a biological, it's hard to say, does a biological component to sin, in other words, being born that way, does that mean that God created you that way? And does that mean, therefore, that he willed your condition? Now, of course, advocates of a change in church teaching on things like homosexuality assume that this means if you are born that way, that you cannot consider homosexuality, and by extension, we would have to say sins like violence and lust or any other tendency as with a biological component to be sinful. After all, God made you that way. It must be the way he wanted you. I've even heard some defenders of the church's teaching say that homosexuality is not biological, and therefore God did not make them that way. The assumption here on both ends of the argument is that if someone is born that way, God must have created them that way. But is that true? Well, is that true of substance abuse, for example? Science shows that there is a huge genetic component and biological component of substance abuse. These are very, very strong influences on somebody who enters into an addiction. However, not everyone with a biological disposition towards substance abuse ends up abusing substances. Other factors come into play as well. Social conditions, for example, and the choices that the person makes in his or her life. So did God create some people with substance abuse? Does that mean that he willed them to become addicts? Now, hopefully it's obvious that God would not will anyone to become an addict. Therefore, a biological predisposition does not indicate that something is God's will. In fact, we know that original sin caused fallen human nature. And this includes fallen biology, as well as fallen personalities, fallen relationships, and fallen circumstances, a fallen world. God does will that we strive against the effects of original sin. That's why he did not take away these effects in baptism, and he sure could have. But he wants us to strive against these effects of original sin, against our fallen nature, so that we strive to embrace his will and his goodness, and ultimately to love him. It's a foundational Catholic teaching that original sin has caused fallen human nature, which in turn leads to a tendency towards sin and ignorance. Those are the two classic effects of original sin, sin and ignorance. And we need to strive against these as part of our love for God. So if human nature is fallen, why would we assume that genetics or that biology are not fallen? Why do we connect born that way to created that way and therefore to God's will? Well, unfortunately, the answer lies in another heresy that we fall prey to both in our culture and in our church. And this heresy is called biological determinism. This is the belief that our genetics or other inborn biological influences determine our behavior and that we don't really have much in the way of free choice. In other words, we're simply animals operating out of instinct. Now, biological determinism is an expression of the materialism, of the heresy of materialism that we talked about in the first episode. So I guess biological determinism wouldn't be the heresy, it would be the error that comes out of the big heresy of materialism. And remember from our first episode that materialism is the belief that reality only consists of what can be known through our senses. According to materialism, since free will cannot be scientifically proven, it cannot be a sufficient explanation for human behavior. And that's why materialists like B.F. Skinner, who is the famous behavioral psychologist, wrote books like Beyond Human Dignity and Freedom, basically stating human dignity and freedom don't exist, so get over it. That's their stance. Even Catholics who don't fully prescribe to materialism can fall prey to its influence. But biology does not determine our personality or our destiny. And in fact, most psychologists will say just that. They will tell you that biology is a factor among many. It certainly is a factor in the direction our concupiscence goes. But a biological predisposition to something does not remove choice. So I just used the word concupiscence, and I realized that maybe we need to define that. It's a big word. It's a very theological word. But fallen human nature gives rise to concupiscence. And concupiscence is a fancy theological word for unruly physical desire that leads us to sin. That's all it is. And the way St. Thomas Aquinas explained it is that the sense appetite, which means our physical desires, get stronger than they should be, so that our desires get out of proportion. And then also our intellect and our will, our desire for truth instead of just physical desires, and our free choice, those two things are weakened and confused. And so concupiscence is when the desire takes over and it leads us to things that are bad and bad for us. So concupiscence is a word that I will use a lot in this series because it's a very, very foundational dimension of fallen human nature. And we need to understand what fallen human nature is all about. So where does concupiscence come from? Well, remember that we are, whoops, wrong slide. Oh, okay. Remember that we are an integration of body and spirit, right? And as an integration of body and spirit, everything has that dual nature. And concupiscence is no exception to that. So concupiscence has a physical dimension and it has a spiritual dimension. Now the spiritual dimension is our fallen personality. We're just weak. We're weak-willed. We don't know enough about what God wants for our lives. And those things are things that we need to work on in the process of conversion that affect our more spiritual nature. But there's also fallen physical nature that leads to concupiscence. And that's where this idea of fallen biology comes in. Okay, so without fallen human nature, our physical desires for created goods like food and drink and sex and comfort, these would lead us to use those goods the way that God intended and in a very balanced way. But with fallen human nature, we tend to grasp onto these things because these are things that our body can sense. They're easy. We don't have to work for them like we need to work for truth and goodness in the spiritual sense. So concupiscence leads us to take the easy route and to make these physical goods more important than they should be. And sometimes we make them into our false gods. But concupiscence leads us to love created goods more than we should, and that's where it leads us to sin, okay? It leads us to overuse them, it leads us to abuse them, and to use them in ways that God didn't intend. And it even leads us to love those pleasures, and therefore to love ourselves, which is key to this, more than we love God. So no matter what its cause, we are called to fight against concupiscence in order to embrace the fullness of goodness that God has planned for us. And again, this is part of God's plan. He could have taken concupiscence away in baptism, but he didn't, because he wants us to strive against it. He wants us to fight against it so that we can fight for the true goodness that he has planned for us, which includes the physical goods, but there's more to it than the physical good. And also that we can strive to love him and to follow his will out of that love. In fact, this is the entire role of morality in our spiritual life. Morality is about seeking God's will rather than our own. But it's also about seeking our own happiness, which is found in God's will, our true happiness. So claims of biological determinism within the church and within our culture are really just excuses to follow our own will rather than to follow God's will. So if homosexuality or violence or anything else the moral law identifies as a sin has a genetic or biological cause, we cannot conclude that science has proven the moral law wrong or outdated. We cannot conclude that these things are no longer sins. So how do we respond? Well, first of all, we can use our knowledge of biology and genetics to understand the source and the nature of our concupiscence. And this knowledge might help us to fight the desire to sin. For example, let's say you have a habitual sin, and you can identify a biological cause for that habitual sin. Addiction is a great example of that. Wouldn't that help you to come up with a plan to fight that concupiscence? Absolutely it would. So that's how this knowledge can be used for on our own behalf to fight our sinfulness, to fight our concupiscence, and to cooperate with grace in order to go through that process of conversion. Now, second, this knowledge can lead us to have greater mercy on others. Now, mercy does not mean ignoring sin in order to be nice or accepting of others. That's some way that many people in the church have come to identify mercy. We don't mention the sin because we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. That's not true mercy. Mercy means acknowledging the sin in others and then inviting them to forgiveness and to conversion because we love them and because we want to lead them to true goodness and to lead them to God's love. We want what's best for them. That's why we confront them with their sin, and that is true mercy. But when we are doing that, we can have true mercy on others by first acknowledging that we all fall prey to fallen biology, to fallen human nature, and to sin. Then we can invite others to join us in the struggle against sin. So it's never me good, you evil, right? It's always we struggle, and let's struggle together. Let's support each other in this struggle against concupiscence, against ignorance, against sin, and struggle to overcome those things to love God more. So let's stop making excuses for our sin. Let's start wholeheartedly embracing the process of conversion and of God's goodness. And that's the treasure that we are uncovering today. Now, right, and I'm behind on my slide. Sorry about that. Next week, we are going to talk about the voice of conscience. So we're going to talk about what is the moral conscience and what does it do for us and how does it work. Because this is another thing that is very misunderstood as well as not understood by a lot of people. So this is going to be a very important episode next week at 8:30 p.m. Central Time. Hope you can join us for the voice of conscience. Right after this episode, I will be entering into the members-only Facebook group, and we will do our members-only meeting, a weekly meeting. And this week we are continuing in the book From Humdrum to Holy by Father Edward Broom. And we are talking about chapter 8, which is the hour of power. It's about making a holy hour. And it's a very short chapter. It's going to be a lot of fun, but I want to make the point that a holy hour is a goal of the spiritual life. But if you're not there yet, don't feel so bad. We're going to talk about that in the members area. Again, if you are not a member yet and you would like to become a member, just go to abbey.ws/member. Again, it's abbey.ws/member. And you can join and get into that Facebook group and join our discussion on the From Humdrum to Holy. Also in the members area each week, if we're not doing a chapter of our book, we are answering questions from the group, or we're working on a monthly spiritual challenge. So there's a lot that happens in that membership, and it's free. So please come and join us, abbey.ws/member. So thank you for joining us. Obviously, this was a shorter episode than last week. Last week went quite long, but this is about the size I would like these episodes to be. Just kind of quick and to the point, but I want it to be something that really, really blesses you. So I leave you again with Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect.